network.
Labor in this panel is going to be very simple. You're going to digest, drink your coffee, and we're going to entertain you. Hopefully the conversation will be interesting enough that you won't fall asleep after the lunch break or due to jet lag, as some of us carry. This panel will be quite different, but at the same time than other panels, but also very much a continuation to the conversation that took place in previous panels. And I want to start by connecting it to the first panel. You may recall, I think it was Fionella and Gilles who mentioned several times in the first panel the importance of good research, of good data, and how important it is to policy making. And basically this is what we are trying to do here, but also more broadly. And for those of you who are less familiar, CTED is a small body a long name for a small body, the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate. But what it is basically is a body of experts that supports the Security Council work on counterterrorism. And we do it in three ways. One is assessing how member states implement the Security Council resolutions. Second, we provide analysis on counterterrorism issues, and we provide expertise to the UN system. As part of our work, we identified as early as 2014-15 that there is a huge disconnect between the research community, the counterterrorism research community, and the policy-making community. Those at the international level who we serve, the UN Security Council. But as was noted in the first session, this gap also exists at local or at national level. So we worked since then on trying to bridge this gap. And the way we did it is by developing what is now known as the Global Research Network. And many of the members of the network are here with us today, and we are very happy to see them here. We are very proud to have one of our founding members of the network, the Sufan Center, co-hosting this event. And what we will try to do, and what we are trying to do, is to bring the conversation between research and policy much closer. And this is what the Global Research Network is all about. I mentioned in my opening remarks one key element of this conversation, and that is the Madrid Guiding Principle. This is a key document that serves the UN Security Council and member states in how to implement, on how to deal with the challenge of foreign terrorist fighters. And that product will be reviewed on the 13th of December. And what we were trying to do is to use this entire conference in order to make sure that the insights of the experts that came here will be part of the conversation of the UN Security Council. One of the unique advantages of this Global Research Network is that it's truly global. Everyone knows, those who work in the research community in particular, that there is a dominance for those research institutes that are more resourced, that are more networked, that have more capacity to bring their research to a broader audience. But it doesn't necessarily mean that their research or insights are better or more important than local researchers or think tank or entities that understand better local dynamics and sometimes have better access to other players and better access to regional or local dynamics that a global or a faraway research center, as resourced as it may be, may not necessarily understand. So we're really trying hard to make it global, and this is one reason why we came here, because we wanted to hear perspectives from different parts of the world. And in many ways, we are very lucky today in this workshop to be able to have three different experts that will focus on three different areas, each with its own and unique dynamics. And with that introduction, I'm ready to move on to our first speaker, and this is Mr. Adrian Shtuni. Adrian is a foreign policy and security analyst with a regional focus on the Western Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. I don't need to tell you how important this region is for the foreign terrorist fighters phenomena, historically, actually, if we're going all the way back to the early 90s, and I'm sure you will say a few words about that. He consults to international organizations, academic institutions, and private consulting firms, first in the US, Europe, and in Asia, on radicalization to violent extremism, counter-terrorism, irregular migration, organized crime, and other transnational threats.
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me here. Thanks to CTED and thanks to Sufan Center. It's great to be here in beautiful Doha. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem set, and it's a problem set in the Balkans. We usually tend to talk about religious militancy, kind of forgetting that there is also another component. There's fighters from the Balkans that fight in Ukraine, for example. And they're also foreign fighters. And we need to also understand that dynamic, how one feeds the other and how both sides create an environment that is even more conducive to further radicalization. So we'll talk about that. But first and foremost, wanted to give you a little bit of background in terms of the numbers, and just wanted to echo what was said before in relation to the importance of data and doing putting in place proper policies that are informed by thorough research rather than general anecdotes. These pie charts show a little bit the distribution of those that generally are identified as foreign fighters, but not all of them are fighters. Obviously, as we know, you could see here that about 65% of the 1,100 individuals that we know have traveled to the battlefields of Syria and Iraq from the Western Balkans are military-aged men. The rest are about 20% children and about 15% women. Primarily, that's the distribution. About 38–40% originate from Kosovo. The second country with the highest numbers is Bosnia, and then Macedonia, and the rest of the countries. So that is the distribution per se. Now, I wanted to put the whole number in perspective, right? Because we heard earlier from during the presentation, the first panel, that there's been about, give or take, 5,000 fighters originating from Europe traveling to Syria and Iraq. Well, 5,000 from European Union, right? But Western Balkans is part of Europe, and the 1,100 individuals that have traveled from the Western Balkans to Syria and Iraq are not part of that 5,000. That is for sure. Now, that should give you perspective as to what we're talking about, because the population of Western Europe, in terms of European Union, is about 500 million, right? Whereas when we're talking about the Western Balkans, the population is a lot smaller, okay? And this is why I wanted to give you perspective when I did this comparative study, right? So this is the current situation. About 21% being killed, 31% returned, 48% are either in Syria and Iraq where we don't know, maybe they've moved to other places, or some of them are arrested and are being held in areas in northern Syria. But if we're talking about returnees, because I mean the focus is on returning foreign fighters, this 31%, what do they represent in terms of the Balkans? They represent about 330 individuals who have returned, right? And 94% of these individuals have returned in those four countries, which is Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania, and Macedonia. These four countries have a population of 10.3 million, right? So I wanted to see which other countries in Western Balkans are experiencing a similar inflow of returning foreign fighters. And those 4 countries are Austria, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark, okay? And the population of those 3 countries is 43 million. So if we're doing the math, and it's right here, to see what is the average rate of returnees per million inhabitants, that's what we get. So in the countries of the Western European Union, 7 per million. In the countries of Western Balkans, 30 per million. So it's over 4 times higher, the rate of return. Now, I also wanted to see not just the rate, but what are the capabilities of the countries in the Western Balkans to actually deal with the problem set, right? They have 4 times the rate of returnees compared to countries of Western Europe. Because we often hear this kind of suggestions, well, look at the Aarhus model, look at what the Danes are doing, you know, how they're dealing with returnees. I mean, that could be replicated. Or what other countries in Western Europe are doing. But is that just wishful thinking? And that is what the numbers indicate here again, because I was looking at the GDPs of these countries, which represent the capability, financially speaking, to actually deal with a problem, okay? And that's only one dimension, right? And that is what that's what I found, that basically those 4 countries, same 4 countries basically, they have a combined GDP of $2 trillion and 49 billion US dollars a year. Whereas the countries, the 4 identified countries in the Western Balkans, only $49 billion a year. So they have only the last 2 digits of what those countries in the Western Europe have in terms of capability, you know, financial capability to deal with the problem, right? Although they have over 4 times the number of returnees. Now, that needs to sink in a little bit, right? Because definitely a lot more needs to be done, but we need to also be realistic with what we're dealing in terms of numbers. And the main issue here, and again, I'm not going to take too much time because we can leave it for the Q&A, but the children are one of the major issues that we're facing in the Balkans. Over 200 have traveled from the Balkans. It's a huge number. Again, go back to the original number I was talking about. 94% of those individuals come from a pool of about 10 million people, right? And so that's what you're having. 200 have traveled, but then hundreds more have been born in Syria and Iraq between 2012 and 2018. Bosnia, for example, has the highest number of children that have left. So we're talking about 81 children and about 61 women. And again, also the highest number of women from the region as proportion of the total number of individuals who've traveled to Syria and Iraq. So basically, if you can see, I was reluctant to put pictures up there, but then I said, well, let's put them because mostly those kids are handling weapons in those pictures. And that is the problem. How do you undo that? And it's going to be a long challenge. Obviously, there's going to take a lot of specialized dedication and support that, again, takes means, takes funding, and takes patience. Now, this is the part that is also important we need to talk about because it feeds those sentiments that galvanize violent extremism and generate more recruitment into violent extremist organizations. Now, this is according to the security services of Ukraine in 2017, about 300 citizens of Western Balkan countries had joined militias fighting in Ukraine on the side of Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. They primarily originate from Serbia, Bosnia, and Montenegro. And some of them are affiliated with one of the organizations is well known in the Balkans, Srpska Čast, which is Serbian pride, honor. which is a paramilitary formation. That individual right there at the very corner is, wearing the emblems of that organization. So there's also a smaller number of Croats that have gone, a few dozens, that have joined the Azov battalion. They are right there in the middle, on the other side, right? So who are these Srpska Čast? So these individuals have gone to fight in Ukraine, but they belong to this paramilitary organization. This is 3 pictures to kind of show who they are. Serbian honor, basically, according to its leadership, counts about 40,000 members in the Balkans and the diaspora. Propaganda material, so that's on the left-hand side, upper corner there, that's their emblem. That's what they use. Again, clearly they use religious symbols and indicate their propaganda clearly indicates ultra-nationalist views and goals. Self-described as a humanitarian organization. Now you do you come to your conclusions. This is a humanitarian organization for Serb war veterans, right? And so they're linked to the Night Wolves, a known organization. And then in February, for example, what's happening to returnees? Okay, are they being put in prison, or what are they facing when they're returning? 28 Serb foreign fighters were found guilty of fighting in Ukraine, but only 4 of them received minimal prison sentences. The other ones went home, and their sentences were commuted, and so on. So basically, this is the situation in terms of returnees, or fighters and returnees from the conflict in Ukraine. So in conclusion, basically, we need to understand the full spectrum of violent extremism. It's not just the religious militancy, but also ultra-nationalist militants that are generating a situation and narratives that are creating even more schisms internally and are generating more recruitment into violent extremism. Okay? Once we have a better understanding, we have to keep researching. This is the same as with any pathology. If somebody has diabetes, they can't just go to the doctor once and not go anymore to check their the level of sugar in their blood. They have to go regularly and check, and whatever medication they're taking has to be adjusted periodically. So this is why we need to understand better, use data, and do research consistently. To do research consistently, we need to have capacity that is local, right? And unfortunately, that capacity is not there, and that's why I know I'm not going to do anything that is going to surprise you, but I'm going to suggest and heavily do so that more resources are put into building the capacity of local research institutions and civil society to do proper scientific research on these issues, and to create better forums for interaction between policymakers and civil society and researchers, in a way that policy is informed by proper research. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. You just nailed exactly what this is all about. Yes, we need more research, and we need to connect better research and policy making, and we need to do it at the local level in order to get more insights on how things happen. I really appreciated the point you make about the need to understand the differences in capacity and the differences in numbers. And we see it very often in the Security Council, where the Security Council adopt measures at the global level, but the challenges for countries with less capacity, and just bear in mind that now all countries are required, for example, to integrate biometric technology, and that's a requirement that is mandatory. API and PNR, which are advanced tools for aviation security. And for some countries, that is very, very expensive, and they don't have the tools or expertise to do that, not to mention what you said about rehabilitation and reintegration of those returnees. So that's extremely valuable insights that you brought with you, and thank you. We move to our next speaker, which at least for us in CTED is not a new one. We were very fortunate to have Jennifer briefing the Security Council on the situation in Southeast Asia. As some of you may know, one part of the world where many of the returnees moved to was Southeast Asia, and specifically the Philippines. And Jennifer was kind enough to make all the way from Manila to New York to brief the Security Council on what she sees from the perspective of her research. So Jennifer Oreta is a faculty member at the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Political Science. She holds a Ph.D. in political science and has an extensive research background on security sector reform, peace and conflict, and social movements. So thank you very much, Jennifer, for making another long trip and for briefing us updates from Southeast Asia.
All right, I also have slides, but I will not bore you with, I only have 3 slides, just to show you some of the, just to emphasize some of the points. This is part of a larger research, but I will just focus on 2 major points, the Trilateral Maritime Patrol and the local context. At the height of the Marawi siege, that's the attempt of the ISIS affiliate, and if you will allow me, I will read from my prepared text so that I will not go beyond the 12 minutes that was given me. So at the height of the Marawi siege, that is the attempt of the ISIS affiliate groups to establish the Wilayat, or a controlled territory in the city of Marawi, the Trilateral Maritime Patrol arrangement between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines was officially launched in June of 2017. The main objective of this initiative is to ensure that militant threats like the Islamic State, do not use the Sulusi to gain entry into our countries. And that is a direct quote from Indonesian Defense Minister Hussein. The idea of the Trilateral Maritime Patrol was hatched as early as May of 2016. It is a formal recognition that the long unguarded coastline bordering the Sulusi have long been used as a trading and smuggling routes by criminal groups plying the area. The Marawi siege somehow speed up the agreement of the 3 countries. Indeed, based on information shared by the Philippine military, the Trilateral Maritime Patrol, or the TMP, has helped to secure the borders and prevent more foreign fighters to enter the Philippines to join the then fighting that was happening in Marawi. It helped but did not altogether prevent the entry of FTFs, as attested by the fact that some of the fighters killed in the siege were foreigners, one of which was Malaysian IS leader Dr. Mahmoud bin Ahmed. The Sulu Corridor is just one of the entry points of foreign terrorist fighters in the Philippines. The legal route proves to be another challenge. Like many other countries, tourism is among the major income-generating industry of the Philippines. Prior to the siege was the annual gathering of the Tabligh Jamaat, a religious gathering that happened in Marawi, and a number of foreign terrorist fighters are suspected to have entered the country under this platform. More recently, a bomb that blew up in the municipality of Lamitan in Basilan was also done by allegedly a foreign fighter and entered the country as a tourist. This shows that the policy, particularly of the Philippine government as regards FTFs, is severely lacking. But more importantly, the exchange of intelligence information, especially of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, or Indo-Malfil, is also put to task. The fact that the 3 major countries involved in the research are also embroiled in overlapping geopolitical issues, that is, the exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea, the Sabah issue between the Philippines and Malaysia, and the Sarawak issue between Malaysia and Indonesia. These issues, these geopolitical issues actually stand in the management and treatment of information sharing of the 3 countries. In the operational level, the TMP, or the Trilateral Maritime Patrol Agreement, will have to be translated also to the three states' respective militaries' joint operational procedure. What are the implications of the TMP to the joint and combined doctrines of the three service units of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines? And will it affect the respective countries' military alliance and agreements with other states? Also, the TMP are Defense Department's agreements to address violent extremist groups. But all these three countries also treat terrorism as law enforcement or internal problem, which means they will have to deal also with the police and the Coast Guard, which are both under separate departments. So in order to develop the operational procedures, these two departments will also have to be involved in highly bureaucratized systems like these three countries. Turfing is not a far-fetched issue. The viciousness of the attack in Marawi and the holding on capacity of the group that lasted for 5 months showed the level of cohesiveness and interoperability of the alliance that was created locally. While local in character, it has also brought Malaysian, Indonesian, and Filipino fighters to work together under the guidance of Malaysian Dr. Mahmoud, playing a key role. The terrorist groups of the three countries are working seemingly to perfect the interoperability of their operation. The question then is, will the state departments of these three countries will ever achieve the same? Indeed, the presence of foreign terrorist fighters in the Philippines changed the landscape and the ballgame of the local conflict. The FTFs exacerbate and internationalize a technically local struggle. It also brings, or the FTFs also bring with them new ideas, new skills, as well as international network of connection. They bring to the larger stage what could erstwhile be a domestic concern. Now, if we move to the next slide, please. The local landscape, note that not all, as mentioned in the two previous panels, not all the members of the so-called violent extremist groups in Southeast Asia are hardline ideologues. There are, in fact, various routes to their recruitment. Belief in the ideology is just one of them. In the Philippine context, extremist groups latch on the legitimate and actual struggle of people in Mindanao against a perceived or actual injustice. It also capitalizes on the marginalization, again, actual or perceived, of a given demography, that is, young people in Mindanao, particularly in geographically isolated and depressed communities. It also manipulates the economic need of certain groups by giving them allowances if they join the organization. In other words, the word terrorist, with quotation mark, and violent extremist, again with quotation mark, are not accurate depiction of who they are and what motivates them to actually use violence. A more nuanced analysis and approach to addressing the recruitment route are necessary if we are to make serious dent in preventing and countering the rise of this organization. The security environment in Mindanao, compounded with the increasing disenchantment of the people towards the peace process with the government, allowed for the manipulation of dissent and the germination of radical ideas. This creates a fertile ground for would-be recruits, if not a pool of sympathetic individuals who would support extremist measures. The groups that you see in the slide are all part of what we call the Dawla Alliance. They have relative freedom to move around without fear of detection, to host foreign fighters, to have the freedom to train and be trained in the use and manufacture of terroristic weapons. These conditions is what was deemed by foreign fighters as the conducive environment to create the Asian Caliphate. Consider the two major groups involved, especially in the Marawi siege that happened between May until October of 2017. In 1991, the Abu Sayyaf group was founded by Janjelani, a returning foreign fighter who fought in Afghanistan in the late 1980s. He was influenced by radical ideas while in Afghanistan. He was later killed in 1998, but not after he has indoctrinated others and recruited them in the organization, as well as linked up his international contacts with the local Abu Sayyaf group. So while the operation of the Abu Sayyaf is technically in geographically isolated islands of Sulu and Basilan, the network of connection brought by Jan Jelani allowed the group to operate in the Sulu corridor with networks from Malaysia and Indonesia. The Abu Sayyaf would later on create very close ties with Jamaya Islamiyah of Indonesia, receiving training from JI in bomb making and serving as safe havens to a number of wanted terrorist personalities. They later on would find channels to link with Al-Qaeda and later on with ISIS. The second group, the Maute Group, is an ISIS-inspired armed group primarily operating in central Mindanao. It was founded by the brothers Omar Khayyam and Abdullah Maute, both of which were former contract workers of the Middle East. They both studied in between working in Syria and the United Arab Emirates. So while technically they are not returning foreign fighters, both brothers have established linkage in Syria and UAE, linkages that would prove to be critical in the operations of the Maute Group. The two cases show the potential radicalization of overseas workers, to which Indonesia and the Philippines are major exporters. This therefore begs the question, should governments like the Philippines and Indonesia institute monitoring policies for its contract workers? And if they do, what is the guarantee or the assurance that it will not be violative of human rights? Prior to its prominence as terrorist organization, the Maute Group is also an influential family in the province of Lanao del Sur. They field and support political candidates for local government position. So allegedly, the Maute brothers also operate as warlords involved in extortion and criminal activities. The Maute pledge of allegiance to ISIS is not so much due to the commitment to the ideology, but more an attempt to project a more fierce image, an attempt to arrogate more power using public perception. The Dawla Alliance, as I mentioned, the groups that you see in the slide, has facilitated the coming together of groups that are traditionally divided by geography, ethnicity, and history, and they have worked in the past separately. As mentioned, Malaysian IS leader Dr. Mahmoud played a significant role in the forging of alliance of these erstwhile disparate groups. The Caliphate agenda facilitated the link of the alliance, the link of local domestic conflict with the global struggle, and it has internationalized, as I've said, the conflict. The capacity of the alliance, as attested by the 5-month-long battle, that they were able to sustain must be considered in any security and policy planning, not just in the Philippines, but in the Southeast Asian region. The death of the declared Emir Hapilon, as well as the death of the Maute brothers and Dr. Mahmoud, may have pushed back the capacity of the alliance to establish this wilaya, but the seeds have already been planted, and they are simply waiting for the right time and opportunity to rise and make their presence felt once again. Finally, an emerging concern, particularly in the Philippines, is the issue of surrendering terrorist fighters. As mentioned, not all those who have joined are hardline ideologues, and we are facing a situation now back home where a number of members of these terrorist groups have decided to surrender. The Philippine government, hence, is in a fix. Dealing with them using law enforcement route will discourage others who may also be contemplating to do the same, that is to surrender. Yet the government has also pronounced hardline position against terrorist groups. There is no negotiation whatsoever to be entertained relative to these groups. Hence, we face yet again another policy conundrum. So I end my presentation there, and I thank you for your attention.
I don't think we can say that you ended with an optimistic note, but you raised a few important points which are very critical to the conversation today and clearly demonstrate the importance of understanding the local dynamics, which we very often miss when we speak in broad terms, for example, on issues of prosecution of terrorists, and you were able to identify how complex and nuanced and sometimes even counterproductive a hard-line approach may be. So thank you, Jennifer, for coming again, and thank you also for being a wonderful member of the Global Research Network. And with that, we'll move to a third member of the network, the ISS, and Mr. Akinola Okojo. Akinola is a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa, one of the founding members of the Global Research Network. Prior to this, he was a visiting scholar at the Institute for Political Science, Sciences Po in France. He was also a visiting research fellow at ICCT, The Hague. Akinola holds a Ph.D. from University of Paris 5 and is alumnus of King's College London and the African Leadership Center. Wow.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll be speaking still within the context of foreign fighters, but then I'll also be speaking from the context of the Lake Chad Basin, and particularly in northern Nigeria, where we have the Boko Haram crisis. So I'll be making three main points. The first will be to make a reminder of the fact that there is a transnational character when it comes to the Boko Haram crisis in the Lake Chad Basin and northern Nigeria. The second point will be to also draw attention to certain community actors, local actors in northern Nigeria, for instance, where we have seen them express resilience in spite of the fact that there are so-called risk factors that push people to violent extremism. And the third and final point will be to highlight how policy can benefit from the input of certain local community actors who can help to counter the ideological threats posed by foreign fighters or even the wider problem of violent extremism. So one of the most significant security challenges to confront the Lake Chad Basin and especially Nigeria is the Boko Haram crisis. Now, this is a crisis which has affected the northern region of the country, of which the northeast zone has particularly suffered the worst shocks of violence over the last decade. In the northeast zone, most of the time, the media reports fatality figures in the range of 30,000, sometimes 35,000, as high as that. And you know, if you take a different way of looking at this fatality figure, 35,000 is it's more than half the size of Nigeria's national stadium in the capital city, Abuja. So in other words, we're talking about Boko Haram giving Nigeria half the size of a stadium of dead people. Now, that's a huge figure, looking at it from that point of view. Or maybe perhaps we say it's 1/3 of some of the other bigger stadiums, but it's still huge. Now, in the northeast of Nigeria, which really is the epicenter of the crisis, we find that already there are existing patterns of foreign fighters. The trend has always been there. It's been there for decades. When you look at the countries in the Lake Chad Basin, for instance, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and of course Nigeria, you find that even in the 1980s, when we witnessed what was known as the Maitatsine crisis between 1980 and 1985, there were already people crossing borders between Cameroon, Niger, and Nigeria. Now, with the context of the Boko Haram crisis, perhaps the main difference is the fact that there's a phenomenon of suicide attacks, which wasn't existing at the time in the 80s. And of course, the violence frequency is much higher. Now, already this transnational character, obviously, it's compounded even further by the adverse impact of climate change in the Lake Chad Basin countries. Now, if we take a glance at the northwest of Nigeria, unfortunately, I don't have a map, but I'll try to be descriptive. The northeast really is where the crisis is. But if you look at the northwest of Nigeria, there are countries like Niger sharing borders with Nigeria on that side of the country. And you find very similar dynamics in terms of the politics, the socioeconomic aspect of things, and also the religious dynamics. The Northeast, you find, you could ask the question, to what extent can we really say that these individuals crossing borders are really foreign? Are they really foreign? It's a very important question because when citizens or individuals crossing the border from Niger to Nigeria or vice versa, looking more deeply, they actually share a common history, a common language, a common culture, a common religion, and even a common occupation. So you find the same people speaking, for instance, a language, the Kanuri language. They belong to the Kanuri ethnic group. There is a common religion that binds them together. And then you ask the question, what implication does this have for the kind of policies which we formulate to address the problem of foreign fighters? Are they really foreign? So that's another, and it's a different debate altogether. Now, in the Northwest Zone, you find that also that part of Nigeria where you have some administrative units like a place called Sokoto State. You find individuals who also have, kith and kin across the border on that side of Niger's territory. And I visited Sokoto State in 2014 and again in 2015, and I crossed the border. And I found that I could speak the same language which is spoken in that part of the country with those living on that side of the Nigerian border. And even in Maiduguri, when I visited in 2015, you find the same trends. Now, in the Northwest, in spite of the fact that at the height of Boko Haram's crisis, around 2011, 12, 13, in spite of high levels of poverty, both absolute and relative poverty, in spite of the fact that there is a history of religious-related crisis there, the communities there have been able to express resilience against these factors. And then we ask why, or how has this been possible? And I think this is where research really needs to, be more critical in terms of finding out the factors that explain why we don't see, a high level of Boko Haram's crisis expressed there. And it's another question altogether, but then there is research bringing evidence that shows, or at least suggests, that there is something about the historical identity of the people there. For instance, in the Northwest, in Sokoto State, where I mentioned, you find that there is a strong sense of the legitimacy which the people have or hold their history. There was a jihad that took place there in the 19th century. It was one led by a man called Usman Dan Fodio. The jihad occurred between the years 1804 and 1808, but it lasted for 100 years in terms of the caliphate which it established. And when Boko Haram began to push its own type of jihad or its own type of ideological narrative to that part of the country, the people and the communities there resisted it. There were a few who joined, but the large number of people, the majority of those in that part of the country resisted it because they found that the jihad which Boko Haram was pushing was not the one which they were familiar with. They already had experienced the kind of jihad which they already knew. So you find some kind of counter-narrative there. And even to show that, indeed, there was power in that narrative, Boko Haram itself was actually tapping into that narrative and using it to reinforce its own membership. So, for instance, when Boko Haram says they are calling for a caliphate to replace the current Nigerian structure, so they tap into the fact that there was once a Sokoto caliphate in the 19th century, and they're trying to recall it. There's a glorious past which they want to bring back. But then the people of that particular part of the country also are the authentic beneficiaries of that jihad. And they use it against Boko Haram, or they have used it against Boko Haram. Now, when we always quote, we use arguments like, okay, poverty pushes people, deprivation, and things like that. We need to exercise some caution when we use, attribute those factors as reasons why, people get pushed to violent extremism. It is a very valid one. It's one which requires attention. There is a need to address deprivation factors. But then, if that were the case, places like the Northwest in Nigeria, where you have high levels of poverty and the kind of, historical trends there, we don't see the same kind of violence occurring there. So we ask the question, what else has, reinforced their resilience? And I think resilience is a very important factor because life still goes on in some of these communities. Now, my final point about how policy or policies can benefit from the inputs of certain local community actors. When we speak about foreign terrorist fighters, it's not only in terms of the physical presence of these individuals that causes a threat or represents one. Sometimes it's also in terms of the ideology which they push. So for instance, we find that, okay, maybe there isn't massive evidence to show that some of the individuals who left the shores of Africa to join the camps of Syria and Iraq had returned, even though we don't find them in massive numbers. Does it mean there is no threat? In March 2015, Boko Haram actually pledged allegiance to ISIS. August 2016, Boko Haram split into two factions, one of which actually is closely aligned to the ideas of ISIS. Now, that itself is a threat. And, lately this year, we've been seeing some court cases taking place in places like Senegal, sort of mapping out links, even though it's still loose, but some kind of linkages between individuals in Senegal and some who may have gone to the northeast of Nigeria. So you still have all this, out there. But the point I'm making is, in terms of countering this ideological aspect of the threats, it is necessary, and I argue it is necessary to identify specific community actors who possess a particular skill set that can counter it, or at least contribute to it. So we're talking about how national action plans and strategies can integrate or more deeply integrate some of these actors. We take, for instance, Islamic clerics. And I think this is where I might have to maybe come up in a debate or counter a little bit of what was said in the previous panel. There was a point being made about how, in another context, clerics or religious leaders may not be effective. But then it's very contextual, because in the case of Nigeria, clerics play a very important role for two reasons. One, clerics in Nigeria's context are most familiar with the essential doctrinal elements that are required to deconstruct the kind of narrative which Boko Haram pushes. In terms of counter-messaging, counter-speech, counter-narratives, clerics play a very important role in northern Nigeria. The second reason, clerics occupy a very important role at the heart of communal resilience, from which resistance against Boko Haram can emerge. And we have examples, evidence to support this. In northern Nigeria and even in Nigeria at large, we have Islamic clerics, for instance, who are mentors and patrons of certain organizations like the Muslim Students Organization, where you have millions of youths who are affiliated to them. You have the National Council of the Muslim Youth Organizations, with millions of individuals who are members. And the youth demographic in Nigeria and even in Africa, even when you speak of Al-Shabaab, is the most targeted group of individuals that groups like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Murabitun, and the rest of them in the Sahel often target. They find them vulnerable and they target them. So you have these individuals who are members of these organizations that clerics are actually the patrons and mentors, providing theological guidance to them. Whether or not the guidance is negative or positive is another debate, but the fact is that they occupy a very, there's a platform that is given to them, and they have access to preach also from the pulpits. And in Nigeria, and also in the Lake Chad Basin, you find that when messages are pushed out even from the mosques or from the places of worship, most of the people who listen, sometimes they take it hook, line, and sinker. They accept it, and they actually use it as a means to plug into the socioeconomic and political, debates. So say, for instance, some years ago, we had the big debate about the Scharia, debate about it being, instituted in the country. Most of these messages were talked about in the places of worship. Clerics played a role in terms of the discussions and the conversations around it, and a lot of people went with it. You have clerics who also have, particular connections with, local governance structures and individuals. The village heads, the ward heads, the district heads, with traditional leaders. An emir, for instance, a sultan. They consult clerics. I happen to have been in one of the palaces the Sultan's Palace actually in Sokoto State in 2014, and they have meetings there every month or every week actually. So they're actually consulted by some of the leaders who have the legitimacy within those communities, beyond the states. There was a reason why Boko Haram particularly targeted clerics between 2010 and 2013. And I'll tell you why. A reported 18 clerics were officially confirmed killed by Boko Haram. And one of the reasons was not only because Boko Haram was using an exclusivist doctrine, but also because Boko Haram recognized this particular community actor as very potent in terms of the way they mobilize people. So I'll stop there, and hopefully maybe during the Q&A and other private conversations, we can have some conversations around these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Akinola. I mean, the wealth of knowledge that you bring and, again, the importance of understanding local nuances, what works in one region will not work, and the need for more research to understand resilience of communities so that we could use them perhaps for other areas of the world. These are all very valuable insights, and thank you for coming and for being with us. We have a rare opportunity here to have a policymaker turned researcher. And that is Mr. Zango Abdu, who is, has more than 30 years of experience in the diplomatic and intelligence community in Nigeria. He worked in Africa, Europe, and the Americas, and he has served in numerous ad hoc governmental assignments, including in the area of counterterrorism. And today you are the interim director of the Sahel Institute for Strategic Studies. And if you don't mind, before, I know you made a presentation and are ready to share with you your research, but if you could say also a few words from the perspective of research, a policymaker turned research, how this interaction can better work, what policymakers need to get more from researchers, and how this dialogue could work in the most productive way. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity for this forum. And I want to thank Ali for providing the push for our counter-terrorism CVE foundation programs and so many other initiatives. The interaction between policy and research is positive correlation, absolutely. I've sat at the policy level in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the intelligence realm, working on counter-terrorism issues. My last assignment was in Washington, where I was the deputy ambassador, and I served on the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. I served as liaison with the various agencies in Washington relating to counter-terrorism. I was also the representative on the Sahel Working Group, an area that is very dear for and I found that very beneficial. Research feeds into policy, and any research, any policy that has no input for research, you will find that there will be gaps. And I've seen that the UN system uses a lot of research in terms of coming up with policies that key in and even resolution of the Security Council. The other thing is that they use it a lot to do due diligence in some of the policies they do to see whether they are working or not. Sometimes they check to see whether they conform with environmental and other cultural issues. And I think this is very important. In 2012, I was privileged to participate on a seminar at Greentree with the UN Counter-Terrorism Executive Committee, and they were trying to interrogate some of their strategies for the year and all this. And I've seen how they key into research to see how they come up with solutions. Most of that, there is no, you cannot say one cup fits all. So they look at the regional context, they look at the global context, they look at even the community context, and they come up with this, and many key researchers. So I think that is very important. And I think that will really now dovetail into what I'm going to talk, and I'm primarily going to focus on the Sahel and touch on some of the issues he raised. I'll start not so much from the pessimistic, optimistic view on the Sahel. In 2014, I was privileged to be part of a team that worked on the Sahel, if you like, a kind of an overview of the security situation in the Sahel at the Inter-University Center Potomac Institute in Washington, D.C. At that time, the general consensus was that the Sahel is an arc of instability. 4 years along the line, 2018, I think it's more than an arc now. It's virtually a belt of instability. The trajectory has not changed significantly. If anything, it has become more complex. Before we are talking of fringe groups, nationalist movements, sectarian movement, Boko Haram. Today we are talking about ISIS working side by side with these groups. They have helped to complicate matters even more. For most of us in the Sahel, and I think this is an area which the UN should focus. When you move to the Sahel, you suddenly realize, if you want to call it, if you like, the dynamics, the kind of relationship between the terrorist groups and even internal dynamics. A lot of the terrorists, including Boko Haram now, they are transforming. They are even resilient. Beyond the jihad they want to wage, they are now moving into criminality, transborder crime, financial crimes, human trafficking, and all sorts of things. Boko Haram fighters who are now demobilized, who are no longer interested, are now being used as kidnappers, as bandits, and all this. I think this is a new focus. This is the new wave of threat that is emerging, and I think we need to study that very closely. And it makes things, bringing in countermeasures even more difficult. So that is one aspect that really concerns us. It becomes even more problematic. That's what the social scientists will say. So that aspect, we need to reflect very much. And I'm glad many of the presenters in the morning and today, Fola had mentioned the issue of more research and looking and interrogating about the operation of these areas. When I look at the Madrid principles, very beautiful, well articulated, all those. But for most of the Sahel, really, people don't know them. Governments lack capacity to even implement them. So we need to find ways and means through which we really address some of these issues about foreign fighters and all. The foreign fighters have a field day in the Sahel. Nobody even knows how many they are. Nobody knows their direction. Nobody knows what they do and all those. So the problem continues to remain there. So that really is one aspect which we need to focus. The good news, however, is also that in the region, in the midst of all these challenges, there is a glimmer of hope. Resilience is being created, like my colleague had tried to point out. And the civil society is really making a very good impact in that regard. And I want to now focus on Nigeria, where you find the civil society organizations are really doing a lot to try to build this resilience. And like Fola said, by trying to look at the local situation. Very important to look at the local environment, bringing in innovation like the clerics you mentioned. In Nigeria, for example, civil society had focused on many key issues like peace building and reconciliation, strategic communication, countering narratives, education, the DDR, demobilization, and reconciliation, and all those. And there are several key civil society organizations that are doing a wonderful job in the Northeast. And I want to give classical examples. The Center for Democracy and Development had come up with this latest study. It's called After Boko Haram, Prospect for Transitional Justice. This is an all-encompassing work on seeing how do you rehabilitate Boko Haram fighters who have served jail terms, who have been de-radicalized, and at the same time, how to create a platform where they interact with their victims. Wonderful study, but when it went to the implementation, they suddenly realized there were a lot of problems, a lot of challenges. Those of them who were their victims said, why are you bringing people who murdered us to now come and stay with us? And those who perpetrated this injustice were saying, but we belong here. we have asked for forgiveness. So you find it's an area where many civil society activists are coming in to see how this study could be very beneficial. This kind of transitional justice is slow, but a workable program. And I agree with Fola that it's something that you need to look at. Area. Then you look at the NIM Foundation, they have been doing so much, in particular in the area of education and skill acquisition. Illiteracy is one of the key drivers of instability, rather than poverty per se. And you begin to bring education on board, then that will now clear the minds of some of those about perception and all those, and create the basis for interaction and all those. And I agree with him also, clerics are playing a very important role. And I had a pamphlet which clerics have contributed significantly on Salafist narratives against violent extremism. This had been produced by CTED. And they provided a platform for many clerics to move around in the Northeast to try to counter narratives and messages from Boko Haram and other fringe groups. And it really worked. The people believe in clerics. There is no way you can dismiss them in West Africa. And you find that now even the Sultan, we have an interreligious dialogue council. They move from one region to the other. Beyond Boko Haram, they are even delving into sectarian crisis and all those. So there is a good news in that direction in trying to build resilience, because building resilience is very important for post-conflict resolution. I would like to hang on there and allow intervention in the Q&A section. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One of the things you mentioned may create a direct link to our next speaker. And I'm sure there are several of you who are skeptical about the relations between policy making and research. They may say, well, researchers will present the research and policymakers will do what the politics of the day dictates. I see that. Absolutely. So we have one, probably the best case study that we could bring on a global level. I'm sure there are numerous on national and local level, but from our perspective, we have one case study of where research and policy worked hand in hand, not only by creating policy that is driven by research, but also taking one advantage that researchers have and policymakers very often lose. In times of crisis, in times of security threat, policymakers tend to focus on the troubles of the day. Researchers have the advantage of being able to look beyond the horizons of things that may come down the road and perhaps now are not seen as a major challenge. And in this regard, I will have great pleasure to introduce Bibi van Ginkel, a research fellow at the ICCT, who is also another founding member of the Global Research Network. Her research focuses on the nexus between international law, human rights and humanitarian law and security issues, and pays particular attention to counter-terrorism issues. Bibi has a wonderful and long-standing cooperation with CTED, and she will bring a case study of the use and collection of battlefield evidence where researchers such as her and us work together to basically develop new policies. Thank you, Bibi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for this nice introduction. Good afternoon. I hope you're all still awake. It's a little hard to look at you because I'm looking right into the sun. It's almost like that. Well, very honored to be on this panel also after these excellent presentations on all the troubles in the regions. And it's also had these kind of threat analysis that we need to look beyond your eyes and to know what we need to be looking for. So I work as a researcher indeed at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism and the Klingendahl Institute, but lately also been working with CTED, even as a senior consultant to CTED, for this particular project. Now, we've been talking today about returnees and the troubles with returnees and the policies that we need, and clearly they are cross-regional. I mean, we've here already had a couple of examples of trying to better understand what the threat is, where it's coming from, but also where it's going and what policies we actually need. And with these cross-regional problems, particularly policymakers are looking at ways to deal with this problem, to manage the problem, manage the threat, but also to come up with counter policies. And one of them is, of course, a policy that fits in a rule of law framework. Now, we started working with CTED, or in sort of a cooperation hand in hand, when some years ago David actually mentioned to me, because he's been chairing a lot of these working groups with prosecutors in the network that CTED is managing on the implementation of a lot of the Security Council resolutions. Some issues that prosecutors flashed out, saying, well, we sometimes come across cases where we like to prosecute individuals, but we have trouble getting to the right evidence, because this evidence basically sits in battlefield situations, high-risk situations, conflict situations, and we as civilian prosecutors just don't have the capacity and don't feel secure to actually go there and harvest that kind of evidence. And he mentioned it to me and said, well, can't you have a look and see whether we can come up with a project to better understand what these challenges are, mapping out these challenges, and possibly also looking for different possibilities to come up with solutions. So indeed, we started working on this, first of all, looking at situations that already existed, because this is not new, and it's also not new that you look for different partners in finding solutions for this problem. And this was particular in the field of the military, that are normally the actors that are present in these conflict situations, high-risk situations, where civilian prosecutors or law enforcement officials just simply cannot enter. And these examples, these earlier examples, were very illustrative for what the challenges that we wanted to map out, but also the kind of solutions that we were looking for. Now, you can think of the assistance that military gave, for instance, to the international criminal tribunals, to the evidence-based operations that were run in Afghanistan, mostly, but also the counter maritime piracy operations, where naval operations were basically assisting law enforcement on the coast areas of the coast of Somalia, the coastal states of coast of Somalia. And so we looked at the challenges that they were facing, the legal challenges, but also the very practical military challenges, to map out under what kind of jurisdictions military should operate, under what kind of mandates, what the legal challenges are indeed if they start working in cooperation with law enforcement, and as I said, the very practical challenges that military face, because they are first and foremost there for a reason, namely in an armed conflict, to first of all make sure that you work towards a secure situation. So obviously, when bullets are flying left and right along your ears, you have trouble to secure a crime scene as you would normally do if you're a police agent. So these kind of questions we needed to flash out, make sure that everyone had a chance to give input, and we did this through a research seminar in 2014, and came up with a nice report that eventually was the start of our whole trajectory together. clearly, we knew that there was a reason to explore this field and to look for solutions, which now, particularly when we're talking about the whole issue with returnees, become very interesting for national prosecutors if they can find a way to team up with military to find good cooperation ground and work within a rule of law-based framework in full compliance with human rights and international humanitarian law, fully in compliance with the rights for the defendants, the fair trial principles, the chain of custody principles that are so important in a criminal procedure. When we had this report ready, we were talking to each other and said, well, the thing is that the policy field might not yet be fully ready for introducing this as a new idea because of all the sensitivities. And we were very well aware of all these sensitivities. But we used sort of the academia or the academic platform to introduce this topic, and I went to a lot of platforms and international conferences to talk about the possibilities here. And I think it was once the whole problem with the foreign terrorist fighters started that had the potential of this cooperation between military and law enforcement became more appealing and got some traction also by policymakers. I wrote another paper particularly looking at this problem with foreign terrorist fighters and returnees and connecting this to the whole idea of collecting evidence or information by the military to be used as evidence in court by law enforcement agencies. Had to make it more tangible for the discussions that were going on in the policy arena. And I think it's now 1.5 years ago, I think, David, that we had a side event during UNGA where we actually launched our cooperation to start developing UN guidelines on this role of military in collecting evidence and how they can assist law enforcement actors. Now, you might think that this is still very far-fetched, but I can assure you that it is already taking place. There are already examples, and what we like to do with these UN guidelines is give, as it says, some guidance to those states that actually also think that there is some potential in order to move as quickly as possible from a war paradigm to a law paradigm and to a rule of law-based response to the problem of returnees and foreign terrorist fighters. And thereto we are fully aware that we are working in an environment that is an exceptional situation. And I know Fiona is sitting just across from me, and she talked earlier today about this tendency of working within this paradigm of exceptionalism, which is not a good way forward. And yet we are also looking for ways to address this issue that is right there in front of us, knowing that there is gold on the battlefield that we can use, either it's in documents, either it's in biometrics that are left on explosive devices, whether it's in databases, in mobile phones. There's all this information, including the witnesses that are there, that can be actually used to prosecute foreign fighters, the perpetrators. And doing that, instead of going through sort of an alternative prosecutorial strategy where prosecutors, by lack of access to the battlefield and not being able to collect that kind of evidence that is really pointing to connections to particular terrorist attacks or connections in networks, they are prosecuting individuals for membership of a terrorist organization, for preparatory acts, for conspiracy, for attempts to travel, but not for the actual attacks that they committed, which is not doing fully tribute to the victims and is also another way of sort of settling for a form of impunity for that part of the crimes that were committed. So knowing that gold is out there, knowing that there is a possibility to work together. We now have to find a way to make sure that we are not falling in this category that Finola had calls this exceptionalism that is the wrong road ahead. So in this attempt to look for this cooperation between military and law enforcement, we are reiterating that this is a way that we can only use in these exceptional situations where the rule of thumb is as civilian as possible and only as military as necessary. And when we are moving in this cooperation with the military, that we flash out and specify to the maximum extent possible and politically feasible way all the rule of law and human rights basic principles that need to be taken into account. We do that by, first of all, making sure that military only are operating under an international legal mandate, doing that by making sure that national contingencies, maybe sometimes also within their own borders, are doing that with the proper mandate and proper powers to do so, for instance, because it's an emergency situation. They do that in close cooperation with law enforcement agencies, for instance, by embedding them or having hotlines and making sure that the connection is there. We flash out the jurisdiction issues that are out there, the legal issues on making sure that we mitigate the exceptional circumstances under which military in chaotic circumstances might sometimes have to operate, are understood by law enforcement agencies, yet we look together for ways to best protect the rule of law-based approaches, and looking at best way and practices for military to do this by creating evidence grids and all kinds of modalities that can help them in moving forward. And so the objective is the rule of law approach. We came from research and we brought it to the policy level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bibi. We are very, very proud of this cooperation, and I think you highlighted several points that from the perspective of the policy design and the policy support that CTED provides to the Security Council, we benefited tremendously from your work. And first is, as I mentioned before, the ability of researchers to see issues that are beyond the horizon. And remember, when the project was developed, it was 2014. It was way before ISIL was even known as an entity. Second, we knew from CTED that there is a problem with battlefield, but I think we were humble enough to know that this is a far too complex problem for us as an office to try to handle by ourselves. We need the support of researchers who are able to dedicate the time, attention, and research capacity to come up with solutions, then don't end up with what was mentioned earlier in the first panel as hasty solutions. And for that, only researchers may have the time to come up with such products. Then you also mentioned another area of advantage of working with researchers, and that is political sensitivities. Sometimes we can come up with good ideas, but the political environment is not ripe for that. Researchers have the benefit that they're not bound by political sensitivities. They are not committed to political dynamics. They're not reporting to political office bodies as we are, and are able to pursue agendas because they're important, not just based on their limitations. And lastly, as some of you know, Resolution 2396 recognized the work, the important dimension of battlefield evidence, and basically put together the research and the work that we have done together in a Chapter 7 resolution that is binding on all member states to collect and use battlefield evidence, of course, with all the safeguards and other requirements that, again, we don't have now a time to get into, but with the work that has been done by researchers, we are able to show some guidance or at least some limits.
Thank you. Major General Ansari, Chairman of the Counter-Terrorism Committee in the State of Qatar. First of all, I would like to thank the panel for such fruitful information for global and multiple geographical issues. My question is to Linda, because this is definitely, she touched on very, very important issues which we are facing here for the process of designation, domestic designation. When we really shifted to domestic designation, the international cooperation intelligence reports comes to us, and these reports and evidence does not really goes to the level where it really could be presented to the domestic court system, to the judicial system. So therefore, you'll find it always difficult, to take this individual towards the court with the failure, and then he would just definitely get, free afterwards, because you did not have enough evidence, and those intelligence evidence does not count as, a very vital evidence through the judicial system. We face so much problem with this. It's a gap, actually. There is certain intelligence information tells you to really designate this individual, but we would like to really have a very valid, strong case toward this. I was wondering if, based on your research, Linda, if you really find a solution to this, to really fill in our gap between the judicial system and the designation system.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. It is a little wider than what we have been touched upon, but it touches upon the whole question of, can you use intelligence in court as evidence? That might not even touch upon the issue of battlefield evidence, but is a broader issue. And clearly, we're talking about different ways of gathering information. There are different regimes, there are different legal constraints to the regimes and the ways and the means that officials can get that kind of information. Intelligence is basically to ensure that you preserve your national security, and for that you work under secrecy, and you keep your resources confidential, etc. Whereas in a rule of law and more in a criminal court setting, it's all about transparency and the rights of a fair trial for the defendant and the suspect. So clearly, if you are starting to use intelligence as evidence, you are getting yourself in a sort of a contradiction in the terms of the way that the information has been gathered, the confidentiality of the resources versus the transparency of the resources and the equality of arms that is so dear in a crime setting, in a criminal court setting. There are ways and means in different countries, different jurisdictions, where this has been addressed by ensuring that there might be an advocate general, there might be who can actually assess the information and make sure that to a certain extent the rights of the suspect will still be respected. It's different in different jurisdictions, so I cannot give you an answer to what would fit your jurisdiction, but there are ways that you have to mitigate this contradiction in these two principles. Now, within the battlefield situation, we run into the same problem, because military might also be gathering information for operational purposes, and then they call it military intelligence. Now, one of the ways to deal with this is to process information once they have gathered it in two trajectories. One where they process it according to their rules for keeping resources and sources confidential, and one where they take another turn and make sure that they do it in full compliance with the right of fair trial and the right of the suspect. So that might mean that someone else might be handling that information, bagging and tagging it, making sure that it goes through the chain of custody, that it's clear where the information was picked up, who's been handling it, and everything. And that needs to be clear in order to be used as evidence in court. So, but the idea is that from the moment the information is collected, there is someone that can make that assessment saying this piece of information is not only of importance to our operational trajectory and for military purposes, but also for this rule of law and prosecutorial strategy and trajectory to be followed. And that is a decision that needs to be taken, but it is also a mechanism that needs to be in place. And there need to be officers or liaisons that know how to handle that information.